All right, welcome back to another episode of Rebooting the Blue. This week we've got Chris Humphreys with us, and we are talking about things that actually help after a hot call. So just, keeping in mind that this is not medical advice, we're not doctors. This is just educational, hope to help with your mental health and well-being. Chris, thanks so much for joining us today. Always love having your expertise and experience in the room. So I think first, I just want to dive in and have you help us understand the difference between post-traumatic stress symptoms and post-traumatic stress disease or disorder after an incident.
Yeah, well, and this is where I'm going to try not to get on my soapbox about. I mean, I hate and some teenage minds out there might chuckle, but I hate the D on the end of the PTSD, right? I don't. I mean, of course, I work diagnostically and I can diagnose, and we do. It allows us to work, with insurances, and it also allows us to have a playbook for treatment to do diagnostic stuff. But um, post-traumatic stress disorder, that's what the D stands for, right? That's kind of a different experience. And I'm one of those that I'm firmly on board with most of it. I call, it's PTSI, right? It's a post-traumatic stress injury
Mhm.
because, you can, and man, many of the people we work with recover from that. Like a broken bone is a metaphor a lot of people use. It can heal and it will heal, and in some cases heal better, or your system will make changes to compensate and essentially become stronger, or proper workarounds. Um, and that's really where post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, at least my view, comes in. Now, again, from the official sort of diagnostic, and not to get too nerdy, what separates PTS, post traumatic stress, or an acute stress response from post traumatic stress disorder is really the length of time,
Okay.
right? If somebody goes through a extremely traumatic experience, and technically it's again diagnostically, it's like exposure to death or a life threatening event. Um, it's expected that for up to essentially 6 months, you will have and you can experience certain things like flashbacks, sleep disorder, intrusive thoughts, jumping at loud sounds. Now past 6 months, and again, this is for the diagnostic, right? It's for the nerds that need to fill out the paper forms for us to send into your insurance, right? Past 6 months, now we start to look at it's becoming a disorder, essentially because it's inhibiting your ability to do, function, and I'm going to use air quotes, normally, in society, within relationships, within your job, within, right, and that's when we get to the difference of post-traumatic stress disorder versus just an acute stress reaction. An acute stress reaction, ideally, you do process it over time and kind of get back to the term would be baseline function. Now, again, this is where I get a little wordy because I'm a huge believer in post traumatic growth,
Mhm.
right? And so I hate it when, the medical model kind of says back to baseline function. I'm like, can you really? And some of the stuff that our first responders see just on a daily basis, how do you define normal baseline operations when, right? I mean, I recently worked with some first responders that had a pediatric death, right? I mean, and those can be extremely, right. And then how do you say, well, and then they go back to, after trying to breathe life into a, infant child on the
Mhm.
scene of this wreck, in 6 months they return to normal baseline function. Again, what is that, right? When you're experiencing those types of things. So little wordy description, I guess, but that's really the difference between the two, is just kind of the length of time and sort of the effect that it has on the person and their relationships and their job, and those things that we kind of measure.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I love that distinction that you're making there, right? Like these reactions are understandable, right? Like you've had a traumatic experience and the body and the brain might react in certain ways as a result, but then it's that prolonged nature of it negatively impacting, life. and interacting with others that gives on that really that diagnosis. But I also want to just make space for the fact that um, that reacting to those kinds of incidents or having those feelings or those challenges after an incident is not like a weakness, right?
No.
Like that's an understandable thing after a really traumatizing experience. And I also want to make space for some people might not, right? Like I've talked with folks, I've talked with some people that have been involved in active shooter incidents, and I know one guy that had to take the shot and he slept great, right? That doesn't mean that he's a bad person because he slept great that night, right? Like he did his job. He did it well in a horrible situation, where he had to make some decisions that are tough, or that he's trained to make and had to make. And so you're not a bad person if you sleep normal. You're also not a bad person or weak if, like, for example, after like the active shooter that I was involved in, I was awake for like 3 days and I slept maybe 4 hours in that 3 day period. And I was just wired, right? And it was really interesting for me from just like an intellectual standpoint to observe that process for myself, because it was just so odd that I couldn't sleep. And I swear to God, if one more person told me to like just get good sleep, I was gonna like punch their throat. So,
Eat
so
right, sleep right, again, return to
yeah,
normal baseline function,
yeah,
basic needs. Yeah, that's we preach that. But I, there's a reason we preach that, and you know,
hmm,
and I think it got lost in sometimes when we're doing so many debriefs and we're doing these educational things, and it's easy to hand out a one sheeter that says, right, eat right, sleep right, you will notice these things,
hmm,
don't do this, don't drink, don't, and it's easy to preach it and get it out there, and then we can sometimes again check the box that the person's been supported, right?
yeah,
And I'm not criticizing that. We need to continue, right, to provide the education. But when I was entering law enforcement, almost 3 decades ago, knuckle dragging Chris Humphreys, that's the education I needed. No, I mean, let's be honest, right? That's the
fair,
education
fair.
I needed. We didn't know anything about that. We were starting to hear that stuff, but now, you have multiple generations of law enforcement and first responders hired that, I mean, they've got access to podcasts that just are high level. They're so far beyond the eat right, sleep right,
Yeah,
that sort of becomes pedantic. But you made a really good point there about the 2 points actually. And if we're talking about what to do after a hot call,
yeah,
um, but you made, we're going to be kind of circular in this discussion, but you made two good points. The one about, and I've done well over 100 like critical incident stress debriefs in the last like 5 years, and it's of course, the ones that are having the reaction that, I'm not sleeping or intrusive, I mean, that's one thing. And they'll come up afterwards and kind of talk to you, after. Uh, but the really interesting one, and the one I've heard so many times, is the one that kind of, they're waiting by the doors, everybody's leaving the debrief right after, and they'll kind of slide up and they're like, hey, um, I'm not feeling anything, right? I mean, I'm not feeling bad. I'm not
hmm,
feeling good, but I'm just kind of okay with it. It's the job. And then I don't, you may have to bleep this, but usually the phrase is, hey, Humphreys, am I fucked up? Because is something wrong with me because I don't feel bad. Everybody here is talking about, and I slept fine. And, again, validating that. And that's usually a result of what, when you asked me the question of what can we do after a hot call,
hmm,
um, well, most of what we should be doing is before the hot call,
okay,
right? And we look at it, and again, I tend to, I'm the dumbest guy in most rooms that I walk into, so I really need like thinking framework models, modalities, and the one I love, especially, it's kind of the post-traumatic growth and resiliency model, but it talks about even prior to the incident, what are the two things we look at is your environmental resources, your environmental system resources, and I'm kind of going off memory here, so I hope I don't butcher this. But that would be like your outside supports.
hmm,
Ideally, environmental system resources for first responders would be your employment, right? How how are our jobs? how are our employees or our employers supporting us in resiliency? You know, is it a place where somebody can say, hey, I just had this, I'm a little fucked up, you know, and they're not going to get the, well, that's great, but can you cover this shift? You know, again, I'm not saying they got to be these, you know, huggy kissy mentalities, you know, that everybody now thinks is running rampant. It's not. But right, what are the environmental system resources? Is there a peer team? Is there education programs about stuff that's, you know, educated your employees that these things are going to happen and these are very normal responses to abnormal situations, right?
Mhm.
And then the second portion is what we call personal system resources, I think. And that's you as the individual. What have you built up? I mean, everything from, and this is where we get to that eat right, sleep right, you know, but you know, right. I mean, something so basic as your personal fitness, your diet,
Yeah.
your relationships outside of the job, you know, stuff, you know, at home, do you cultivate those, you know, and we tend to see that if those systems are strong, right, those are sometimes the kind of people that, right, say, you know, hey, I'm good with this. You know, this happened. It was horrible to see, right?
Mhm.
But I'm good with this. Now, here's the thing. A lot of times, just like in the trauma world, a lot of times that stuff's subjective, you know, and we got to be careful to compare. And you're like, wow, Humphreys, you know, he lives kind of a rough life outside the job, and he seems to be fine on that. Well, for him, and because of how he was raised and his everything down his genetics, that's actually a strong personal system, you know. I mean, right?
Mhm.
Resource anyway. So that's the lead up to, you know, in areas I think in the resiliency discussion, in this idea of recovering from a hot call,
Mhm.
we do need to be talking about, and we have for a number of years, what to do beforehand. How do we support our people prior to, again,
Mhm.
right? Um, I mean, the last research shows it's a little stale now, but it shows that if you're a cop, right, and you do a 20-year career, you're going to experience 188 critical incidences, right? And now that's the average median, right? That's the middle of the bell curve. But again, in the world of trauma, right, because we know it's subjective, I mean, 188 of those might not bother you at all,
Mhm.
right? Or you may be on this side of the bell curve where it's only four, or you could be on this side of the bell curve where it's 2,000. I
Mhm.
mean, Chris Humphreys, when he was with the Portland Police Bureau over here, experienced a bunch, but you know what? They weren't people I knew necessarily. You know, I'm in a certain space. Didn't Chris Humphreys is the sheriff of Wheeler County, right? Five
Mhm.
generations deep in that county. You may have only experienced five a year, but they're people, right? I know, or I've coached, or involving stuff, right? You know, plus I'm a sheriff. So yeah, you talk about a job where you don't sleep, you know. Um, so right, again, it's subjective. But so if we know 188 of those, you're going to have that exposure. We should be having this discussion like we're talking about today, you know, what
Yeah.
factors into the preparation before.
Yeah.
So
So
yeah,
preparation before is vital. Hopefully we're building that with our, our Lemwa work and our agencies.
right.
Um, so what can folks do after a hot call that can help immediately on top of, right, the like we know the personal just wellness hygiene, like sleep well, eat well, don't drink alcohol, those sorts of things. What can they do?
Um, well, on sort of that higher order thinking, you know, past the basic needs, and the reason really that we talk about the basic needs is there's really sort of two things in the response to an acute stress or a traumatic experience, and there's we're kind of having the conversation of breaking them down into two separate things, and they involve the word self, which I wish we could take that away because the minute you say self anything for first responders, right, they just dial out, whether they mean to or not, right? These are the most selfless people in the world, right? I mean, they will miss a child's birthday to cover a shift or to respond to a hot call, for a perfect stranger. I mean, again, everything about them, it has nothing to do with the self, right? But the two things you want to really focus on is what we call self-soothing, right?
Hmm.
And that is basic needs. Self-soothing is safety. If you have that traumatic incident, especially if you're exposed to something that could have resulted in your own death or that of somebody else, our body immediately kicks in some certain survival mechanisms. That's phenomenal, right? But it's also designed that it has to have a recovery period, right? And in order to truly hit a recovery period, your body has to know it's safe. Now, self-soothing tends to be those things that, you don't have to necessarily have movement towards. I mean, you hear about people, I just sat on the couch and watched TV. I went home and I just kind of wandered around, or I played video games. That's a real, I just plugged into a video game, Chris. Maybe I did have a drink or two, didn't get shit faced, but it just mellowed me out. That that's self-soothing. That's actually okay to a certain extent. Boy, there's going to be some therapists that are going to throw rocks at me. Oh, don't tell them to go back and have a drink. Again, the difference between hammering a bunch down and letting your body sort of hit regulate back to safety.
Mhm.
Um, and again, I could list a ton of those things, but it's everything from just that little hobby that you do sitting at your bench, your workbench, and just kind of let your brain dial out. But again, generally doesn't require a lot of motion, the self-soothing, but you want to limit that. And here's what, because right, self-soothing can turn into right, it can go from good to bad relatively quick, and it's usually again length over time, and that's where we say then you move into, and you need to ask your body, and that's what we tell them. I say, ask yourself. I mean, have I been on this couch long enough? Here's the fact, and if you're asking yourself that question, then of course the answer is yes, I have. Right, because that's kind of a hard. And then you move into what we call right the self recovery. A lot of people call it self care. Right,
Mhm.
that's a little bit more intentional. Okay. That requires some movement. That's that stuff like getting up and going to the gym, or going out and meeting with some friends. Again, we'll say at the bar. Yeah, I know the A&D people out there are going to get really angry with me, and they should. I mean, I remember, you know, major use of forces sort of situations. We'd have the grand jury, which was a huge deal, and then a group of us would go to a bar, and to be honest, I mean, that was very intentional self-recovery, because you have multiple elements: connection, right?
Mhm.
You also have this thing called self-disclosure, which that's where debriefs seem to be very helpful. We
Mhm.
know for post-traumatic growth to be developed, there has to be some sort of self-disclosure, whether it's writing. I mean, on the therapist side, we're always telling, oh, journal. Well, you don't necessarily want cops in a shooting to journal or write down anything, right? But that's why peer teams are really good. Um, because that self-disclosure limits rumination, limits intrusive thoughts, right? It allows for validation.
Mhm.
Once you have some validation, there's that reduction of emotional distress. Um, you know, um, because that emotional distress tends to challenge worldview. And when we talk about recovery from a hot call,
Mhm.
um, that's really overarching what we want to make sure is, as that worldview, as that schema is challenged or changed, right? I could have died, or
Mhm.
or I had to do this and it caused somebody to be severely injured. And despite what the media says, no cop goes out there on their job wanting to hurt people, right? um, it challenges a schema, how they're raised, right? They're entrained to protect, and then they actually have to engage in this lawful use of violence. That challenges a scheme and a thought pattern.
Mhm.
Self-disclosure, rumination, or self-disclosure and connection, and sometimes that's done over a beer around a campfire, right?
Mhm.
That's very healing.
Mhm.
And again, too much of a good thing then becomes a bad thing, and we
Mhm.
need to be careful um, about that. So when I would say, immediately after, those self-soothing engagement, the needs being met, and being okay and not judging that.
Mhm.
Some of us get on our case about, yeah, I sat on the couch and I played video games and I should have mowed the lawn because I had the time off, waiting for the grand jury. It's like, no, let your lawn get a little long.
Yeah.
You're in the middle of something, sit on that couch. You know,
Yeah.
um, we could be doing a better job explaining this to our partners, right?
Yeah.
Um, they're really, this being a first responder is a team sport,
Love that.
right? No, I mean, it really is, right? It really is. And this isn't to say that we should be telling significant others, well, let them sit on the couch. No, it's just that word kind of safe space, not trying to fix, validation, letting them vent.
Mhm.
And then eventually, though, pretty clearly, they need to be moving into some sort of self recovery. And that requires discomfort. That's that, hey, get off your ass, let's go to the gym. You
Mhm.
know, you're a pickleball
Yeah.
fan, I hear, let's get out and move. Um, and here's what I say, this is the power of peer teams and the power of good informed leadership. And in fact, I'll go back to that thing I talked about, environmental systems. We can be great leaders and go to somebody's house, knock on their door. We know they're in the middle of something, and you can absolutely say, hey, I don't need to hear a word about it, but
Mhm.
I'm here to get you out.
Mhm.
Right. You've been soothing enough, you
Mhm.
know. And you got to be careful on that, because it feels like you're putting them in a headlock and dragging them somewhere, but right. Yeah, because we want that connection. So I kind of rambled on a little bit on that, but that would be the framework I would sort of apply.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean that, and that I think that, I mean, at least for me and the way that my brain works, and I hope is the case for people that are listening in, is that just having a framework for how to even approach what to do after that hot call, normalizing that you have to first find that sense of safety. So that self-soothing behavior is vital. Normalize and like don't judge yourself if you're going to go sit on the couch for a little bit. Like that's cool. Or whatever your self-soothing behavior. And I remember, right, like after the active shooter incident that I was in, like I didn't want to talk to anybody, but I didn't want to be alone, right? And a friend came over and we just literally sat on the couch and they just sat there with me. And I like had this dumb movie on that just played on repeat and they just sat there and we didn't talk about it. Like, but I just didn't want to be alone and I didn't want to talk about it. And so it was super cool that that was the response in the law enforcement community, right? Like they were like, yeah, who can go sit on Claire's couch? Go. um, and so that was just amazing. And then that self recovery, that like listening to the body to move into like, okay, it's time, even though like, we might not love the idea to get up and get moving again and to get back out and to get connected. Is there I'm assuming it's different for everybody, but is there like any kind of time frame around self-soothing to self-recovery, different per incident, per individual, like no way to even put a time frame around that or
Uh-huh. I, no, and I would be really careful on that. Although I've worked with some peer teams, and that's why we talk about the check-ins. Next day, right? Next day, and then 48, 72, and then even you know all the way out to 6 months out.
Mhm.
Keeping an eye on anniversaries, because again, recovery from this injury, it's going to be what we call recursive a lot
Mhm.
of times. And that becomes really tough because, we want to go, oh, when am I going to get over it? And we think of it like as this timeline that goes straight and we'll be here, we're done.
Mhm.
Man, no, that's not life. And it's not how your brain works, and it's not how your body works. I mean, it's got to remember bad stuff to keep us alive. And sometimes, the brain will attach to that and get weirdly cognitive. And you'll find that, you know, Tuesday through Sunday, I was great. And then something happens again, right? And Monday, man, I'm back down. And so, that's why we talk about that. But again, really putting a timeline on that can be a little difficult.
Mhm.
But you know, I well,
Love that. I love
well,
that.
and I would also say there's some in man, especially here in this state, there's some amazing sort of cop to doc therapists that are grabbing onto some other stuff that we're looking at that kind of takes this, more of the now that we know the stuff about the brain, and I know I've talked to you before about this, but stuff like alpha stim, the cranial electric stimulation that we're seeing and some agencies are using. I mean, popping that on somebody
Mhm.
after or a few days after. And again, they don't have to talk about it,
Mhm.
right? Um, uh, Dr. Khan and her group's training in the ASAP model,
Yeah.
it's kind of an EMDR for paraprofessionals.
Mhm.
Um, that is an early intervention. Again, going more for the science of just getting the body into that sense of safety so these negative cognitions can't develop. And boy, that's going to get real nerdy, but um, and so that people can get into that intentional right space of getting out. I mean, here's the thing: if you really wanted to say, what is it that we can do better, um, to help? I mean, make sure that person's getting a supportive connection right as
Mhm.
soon as possible, like what you're talking about, somebody just sitting there with you, right? um and then making sure again that we're okay, as agencies, as leaders, as mental health professionals, as peers, as coworkers, and as friends and family, to say that you got the space, that this is a normal reaction to an absolutely abnormal situation,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
um and we're here, and here's some stuff we can do. And you know what? I tell leaders when they're like, well, what can I do for Chris Humphreys, who's, they seem to be on the couch, man, at that point, get next to him and say, hey, follow me. And if that means that, my sergeant's out there learning to play pickleball for Claire, then that's might be what's going to go on, but you're going to save that person's career. Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And I love not putting a time frame on it, because I mean, like, that makes sense, right? Like you said, we're gonna track better, or healthier, or well, or grounded, whatever, safe, whatever term you want to put on it,
Whatever
like
word. Yeah.
resilient, right? We're gonna track, and then we're gonna fall a little bit sometimes, and that's okay. Or we're gonna get impacted again a little bit sometimes, and that's okay. And so it's that staying checked in, knowing that self-soothing is a step, knowing that self-recovery is a step. And then the just the vital importance of systems, and knowing that our systems, and intentionally designing our systems and our leaders, so that they support this process. Because we know it's going to happen, right? We know it's going to happen. Abnormal situations are going to happen in this field of work, whether
On
it's
average, 188, right?
yeah,
188 on average,
yeah,
right?
yeah, and whether it's on the road or taking calls or whatever it is, right? That our first responders
Well,
are.
non-first responders over a 25-year career. So if you work in retail, and I'm not dismissing these people, other jobs, but on average, and this is their whole life. So this would be personal experiences. So like loss or grief, they'll have 3.5
Mhm.
critical incidences by definition, right?
Yeah.
You know, yeah. That's why I'm such a big believer in peer teams, and I've actually experienced this as a guy that's this higher level of care in my job, meaning like they come to me when they need therapy, right?
Yeah.
Because it's become this PTSI or PTSD. I have now experienced because help set up peer teams or work with agencies that are having them put in, or like your guys with the Lemois.
Mhm.
I've clearly experienced. In fact, I've experienced this with your program. Um, when we start out, there's a ton of people banging down my door.
Awesome.
And then these programs come in. I mean, I've seen this now with another agency with Peer Team. I have not had a request from one of their officers in like a month for a session. And their peer team is rocking and doing all the things. And again, kind of the model that, like I said, I'll reference kind of like Stephanie Kahn, is out there sort of preaching and teaching and training people up on. Yeah. And, okay, Chris is going to go out of business. Okay, sweet. I
Like,
mean, for those sorts of things. But yeah, if you can get in front of these, right? Yeah. So,
no, and the peer support team too. I mean, it's vital. It's huge, because we know that in resilience research that a big aspect of that, just for humans in general, is both giving, right, and receiving help. Like, it's that two-way road that is really going to build that resilience, and that resilience in the system. So
well, and
um,
training them in this information that I mean, again, and I just gave the Chris Humphreys idiot version, but I mean, train your peer teams in this. They're the models. I mean, they have flow charts. I think it's like Schaefer, she or he, I think it's a she, has been researching post-traumatic growth and in regards to, I believe, like first responders for like 30 years. This stuff is out there,
mhm.
in our peer teams. In Oregon's an amazing place. I mean, if you look at the law, that in Oregon it says peer counselors trained in counseling techniques. We should go away from, and we are thankfully, this idea of training our peer support members. They used to just, I know when I first got into it years ago, it was validate and refer. No, 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 no. Teach them counseling techniques. Why? Because that's what the law says. They can use them. They're smart enough. Give them these frameworks, and then they don't have to come. You don't have to refer, right?
Yeah.
That's what's happening, like I said, I mean, so that's what we're hoping. And so again, yeah.
No, and I love that. And I do want to plug a little bit as we wrap up, just that all of our Lemois covered agencies can access Steve Bradley, who's been on, Chris Humphreys, for free, whatever support you need, whether it was a hot call that you're following up on, or something else going on in your life. Like, we have those resources for our folks. We also have, I know Chris and Steve can do EMDR, but we also have peers in the agencies that are trained in ASAP. And so those are some options for, again, after a hot call, that you don't have to talk about it in order to get some support with it too. So just focusing on that self-soothing, find safety, self-recovery, and then stay checked in with people and make sure that we're supporting our systems to support our law enforcement, first responders, dispatchers, parole and probation, just everybody. So
Yeah,
Chris,
low barrier is the term. Low
yeah,
barrier, right? That's that environmental thing. If they have low barrier access, like you're talking about, I mean, free to come see a therapist, that's low barrier, right? Peer teams, helping the people get out and do something, that's low barrier. And one last thing, because I have to go, but we tend to use acronyms. I'm the worst.
oh yeah,
ASAP is oh, and I'm gonna die because I cannot remember his
let me
name.
find it.
Sonny Privado is the clinician that invented this. He's a former police officer, a long time, just an absolute hero. ASAP stands for Acute Stress Adaptive Protocol.
Yep,
Yeah, yep.
just found it.
Yeah, no talking, no anything. It's just a somatic intervention. It's not the panacea, but it's just an arrow in the quiver, and seems to be very effective in helping sort of stave off, this, or helping process something so it doesn't become, right, that post-traumatic stress injury.
Yeah,
That's the problem, right? We're designed to experience trauma, but we also need to have a recovery period. Your cops, your firefighters, your paramedics, your ER nurses, they don't get a recovery period, right? They get what? The next call. And 188 of them, that's like, again, that broken leg's not going to heal if you're still walking on it, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and on that note, we hope this has been helpful for folks, just, knowing what to do if you've had a hot call, and reach out if you need support, and we'll be back again next month. Thanks so much, Chris.
Take care.